3, Cincinnati Public Schools Student Achievement and District Instructional Performance Committee of the Whole meeting. I welcome everyone and ask everyone in our audience to silence their cell phones and electronic devices. Ms. Wagner, would you call the roll, please?
Ms. Bolton?
Present.
Mr. Craig?
Here.
Ms. Jones?
Here.
Dr. Moffat? Mr. Morosky?
Here.
Mrs. Weinberg?
Here.
President Lindy?
Here. So this afternoon, just a couple quick things as we get started. Folks will see our goals and guardrails posted on our agenda, as has been the case for our last few meetings. We also had a wonderful discussion on Saturday at our work session, part of which included a new set of board priorities, which we came to in record time, I might add. I think it was something like maybe 6 or 7 minutes. And so starting in our board meeting on Monday, you'll also see those 3 priorities appear on our agendas. For folks who are watching or listening today, there are 3 of them. One is to continue progress monitoring and accountability. The second is to share and reinforce the 2025 budget context and process. And the third is to review and decide on ad hoc committee recommendations. So we were originally going to start with our presentation on progress monitoring and goals and guardrails. And I was going to ask later on in the meeting if we could recess into executive session for the purposes of employment of public official topics. Based on people's schedules today, I understand there's some folks who need to leave early. So what we're going to do with the support of the board is we're going to flip the order. And we're going to recess into executive session now, have that discussion, and then come back probably in about 45 minutes or an hour to pick up the progress monitoring discussion. Before I ask for that motion, I was going to ask if people will permit me to take just 30 seconds and say something about the war that's taking place in Israel and Gaza. Is that okay with everybody? What? Take 30 seconds to talk about the Israel situation. So thank you. I think this situation's been heavy on my heart since the terrorist attacks the weekend of October 7th. I wanted to thank publicly Board Member Jones for having the idea of asking for a moment of silence at our last board meeting following those attacks. That's something that I truly appreciated. I want to say thank you. And I wanted very briefly to share 3 things myself this afternoon. First is to all of our Jewish and Muslim and Israeli and Palestinian students, family members, and staff. I just wanted to acknowledge what an incredibly difficult time this is. Second, I hope that one of the things our students learn in their education here is the value of life. The Hamas terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians is inexcusable and evil. As Israel responds, the same value of life is equally true. And then finally, to our educators trying to figure out how to talk to your students about what's happening, I want to say thank you. And I want to recommend 2 resources, both of which I've posted on my Facebook page for people who are interested. Thank you, educators, for taking this opportunity to help educate a generation that values life, cares about complexity, and leads with hope and resilience. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to ask if there's a motion to recess into executive session to discuss employment of a public official. Thank you, Dr. Moffat. Is there a second? Second. Thank you, Mr. Morosky. Any discussion on the motion to recess? We'll be returning here. Yeah. Ms. Wagner, did I forget to take roll?
Sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Did I forget to take roll?
Yes. No, you did.
We did?
You did attendance, yeah.
Great. Sometimes I forget this. Great. So no more discussion on the motion. Ms. Wagner, would you call the vote, please?
Ms. Bolton?
Aye.
Mr. Craig?
Yes.
Ms. Jones?
Yes.
Dr. Moffat?
Yes.
Mr. Morosky?
Yes.
Mrs. Weinberg?
Yes.
President Lindy?
Yes, thank you. We're going to aim to end our whole meeting by 5:45. So I hope we are back here around the hour and we'll pick up with the progress monitoring discussion. Thank you. Okay. Welcome back, everybody. We are alive and well, and we're going to keep moving with our agenda to our goals and guardrails update from the superintendent.
Thank you, President Lindy. So if we'll go to our first slide. Okay, so today's update is focused on the guardrails. For our last meeting, we discussed guardrails 1 through 6. Today, we are reviewing goals 1, 2, 3, and interim goals, and goals 5. So our next meeting, as we've scheduled in the review of our goals and guardrails, our next meeting on November the 6th will be goal 1 and 2 for our interims and guardrails 4 and 5. So actually the focus today is on our goals as well, not just the specific guardrails. Next. So the first goal that we're looking at today, the percent of third graders proficient in reading on the Ohio State test will increase from 47.5% in June of 2023 to 61% by June of 2027. So when we look at this first goal and we think about what we're looking at in terms of baseline, as we provided and did the work around our initial goals, we were anticipating what that baseline data would be. Since we have our official data back from the state, we've now gone through and made those updates to that baseline information, so that as we're tracking our numbers and tracking where we are, we're doing that based on where we were actually, not just where we anticipated that we would go. So when we take a look at all of our students, we look at data here that's dating back to 2018-19, and looking at our students across the board. Here we're talking specifically about our third grade students and the third grade population. And for this data, actually for this year, last year we were at 44.7% of our third grade students. We did have an increase in this area for this year. Our goal by 26-27 is 61%. And as we think through it, getting to the 61% by 26-27, we do believe is doable. It will take some more intensive work as we really look between the years 24-25 and 25-26. And one of the things that Board Member Bolton shared earlier when we talked about the numbers around increase is we recognize that we don't see the same percentage of increase or even the same number of increase every year. But this is our first year, and so we do want to make sure that we're monitoring that over the next couple of years. So for our third grade reading proficiency performance, we do believe that we're on track in this area. As we look at the breakdown and as we talk about further have conversations around our gaps, we definitely see in the third grade reading area that there does exist a pretty huge gap between our white students and our students that are Black, Hispanic, or multiracial as well. And so that is an area that we will continue to focus on that has been raised as a priority across the board. The 3-point improvement in third grade reading is, as we referenced, the numbers before. And what this does for us, it just shows us, one, our through line for where we're looking to go by our target. We also see that some of our groups are already at that particular target as we think about where we're looking to go with performance. And the pathway to the goal gives you the just a different view of looking at the increase and the increase in the goals and improvements. Next slide. So before we go to 2, I want to see if there were questions around goal 1. I think before we went through each of the goals and did questions at the end, and some of the feedback was it was too much information at one time to remember what the questions were. So if we'll go back to the previous chart just to see if we have one more chart. So we'll see if we have any questions in this space around our baseline information for our third grade proficiency.
Any questions from board members? Mr. Craig.
So I know you mentioned that there's a certain level of inconsistency in how some groups will, the results will be, but I guess maybe my question is more around, are there potential areas in which you've seen either a pattern that we need to address to improve, or is there a particular group of focus of work that can be done to help improve? Because I do see some of the numbers, especially, again, we recognize COVID had a big number on that, but some groups have not really come back anywhere near the pre-COVID numbers, whereas other groups have kind of gone above or come pretty close to.
Yeah, so two things there. One, my reference to the change in the goals was about when we initially approved our goals. We approved the goals based on a projection of what we thought the baseline would be. So we were approving those with what we thought the baseline would be, and then the additional points that we would add each year to get to the goal. Now that we have the baseline, it updates that information a little bit. So it may be like in the example of this one, we still believe that the 61% by 2027 is the right goal. That's what we agreed on. However, and that's what the board approved. However, when we looked at this number earlier, the number was not 47.5. So now we know that it's 47.5. And then after that, we looked at an increase each year of about 3 to 5%. So that was the reference to the first. In terms of looking at where we look to work just more aggressively with the students. I think across the board, when we look at this data, it continues to remind all of us of the impact that COVID had on our students and our student population collectively, and trying to get back and thinking about even in 26, 27, once we get to that 61%, it's still not where we were in 18, 19. And so it's still not at the pre-COVID numbers, even though it will be pretty aggressive for the district as a whole. So I think this past year, we really spent time in kind of solidifying the expectation around curriculum and what that curriculum implementation looked like. This year, we're spending the additional time doing the same thing, but also doing a little more work around supportive work for students in terms of interventions and remediation, so that we're able to see what we're able to do in terms of bridging some of those additional gaps.
And then one other, again, it's along the same lines of thinking, though. We also recognize that each growing class will be a new set of third grade reading results, right? And so in theory, the thought process is also that we are working with first and second graders so that as they grow up, their numbers should be higher each year as well, correct?
Absolutely. And I think that, especially when we think about where we were this year with early literacy and knowing that we were 0.018 points away from a 2.5 star, and where we saw the difference from us having the increase in early literacy really was the impact of 5 students. And so what we've been able to do, even in this short period of time, is go back into each of the components, but one of them being early literacy, to your point. And we've already started the process of making certain that there's clarity around how that component is calculated, but more importantly, what percentage of our students, as we're looking at the fall to fall assessment, what percentage of our students are on track this year in terms of where we are with our kindergarten students and first grade students versus where they were last year. The other piece that's been added to that conversation that's really been highlighted and lifted as we've been doing our lead sessions for the last 2 days with principals. Our last one is on Monday. But the other thing that has been lifted is the conversation around how many or the percentage of our students in pre-K that also stay with us. And so having access to the kindergarten readiness information for them, so that as we are looking at our students that are moving from our four-year-old programs into our kindergarten programs, how aligned are they already with the expectation of where they need to be for kindergarten readiness in terms of the assessment?
Thank you, Superintendent. Thank you, Vice President Craig. Other questions? Ms. Bolton.
Just appreciate the quote kind of baseline being the pre-COVID and where we were. Somewhere along the line, it'd be great to, and I appreciate this chart, but to look at wherever it is that we are, what are the state numbers? I remember some years ago, we would kind of track ourselves against the overall state. That might be something to think about, or other peers, but mostly where the state is. Somehow that kind of showed us some things we needed to know. So appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton. Any other questions before we keep moving? Okay, Superintendent? Thank you.
Okay, goal 2, please. So goal 2, when we began to talk about this a little bit for 3rd grade, but specifically this goal was around reading proficiency and the gap that exists between our 6th grade African American, Hispanic, and multiracial students and our 6th grade white students. And our goal here, of course, as we think about the numbers, the goal is to shrink the gap. So from 37% in June of 2023 to 17% in June of 2027. So as we look at this area, our baseline information for this year in terms of our actual was 47.4%. And if we look at that information, which we'll talk a bit more about on the other slide, we notice that our gap for our Black students is 48.9, and for our Hispanic students is 49.7, and for our multiracial gap for students is 30.1. So we do believe in this area, trying to get to the 20.27%, we don't believe that that's on track right now. So we really have to look at this next year, how we're cross-referencing the information and the data to really get a better gauge on where we may go in terms of this space. I think the one thing to talk about here is that last year, the gap in proficiency actually increased by 1.6%. And so by 1.6 percentage points from last year, from the previous year to last year. So again, having another round of information in terms of data, I think is going to be important to really determining how we continue to shrink the gap. I think the other thing to think about as we think about the gap, and it may come up on the next slide that we discuss, the other thing to think about actually is here, as we think about our gap, you know, as you're thinking about a gap, you're also assuming to some degree that there is, that one group is growing and another group is not growing, right? And so one of the things that we notice in our data for this year, our combined proficiency for our students of color did improve. So when we think about our students of color and their overall proficiency, there was improvement there. However, our white student proficiency grew faster. So there was growth in both groups, but the growth for our white students outpaced the growth for our students of color. So when we look at the gap, the combined proficiency was 27.4% for all of our students, and then for our Black students, 25.9%, for our Hispanic students, 25.1%, and our multiracial students, 44.7%. So if you're looking from last year to this year, for our combined proficiency, we grew a little over 3 percentage points there, about 3.5. And then for our Black students, there was an increase a little over 2 percentage points. The same for our Hispanic students. Our white students increased by 4.8 percentage points. So there was by a little over 4 percentage points, about 4.1. And then our multiracial students had the greatest increase, and theirs was a little over 5%. So there was growth in every one of the areas, but in order, excuse me, to shrink the gap, the growth has to be accelerated for our students of color as we're also increasing our white population. So let me go back to goal 2, following the same process, just to make certain that there's clarity around this piece, because this one gets a little confusing as we start thinking about the gap. We know that we want our students of all ethnicities to be within the range of each other, but when we're starting with our white students that are so, they're so much farther in terms of the correlation between where they're performing and our minority students are performing. We also want our white students to continue to show improvement and increase as well. And so again, thinking about how we continue to accelerate that movement.
Thank you, Superintendent. Questions on this second item, or comments or reactions? Thank you, Superintendent.
Okay, goal 3. The percentage of first-time Algebra 1 test takers proficient on the Ohio end of course test will increase from 30% in June of 2023 to 50% in June of 2027. And as we know, this was one of our targeted areas for this year. Next slide, please. One of our targeted areas for this year that we were able to meet the goal that we set to start with. So for this one, there really wouldn't be changes as we think within the individual targeted areas. Our goal is to accelerate pretty quickly in this space, accelerating by about 5 percentage points each year, and that's a huge number when we think about where we're looking to go. But even with doing that, again, thinking about the impacts of the pandemic, that will get us a little bit less than where we were pre-pandemic. In 1819, Algebra 1 across the board was 51.6%. So we did get to the 30% this year, which was an increase of about 3%. For our Black students, we increased from 15.9% to 17.3%. For our Hispanic students, 17.5% to 21.7%. For our white students, again, we see that we're looking at the increase, but our white students actually increased at a greater rate. So we increased from 59.1% to 66%, which is a 7-point increase. And for our multiracial students, we also had a pretty identifiable there was actually a decline. And so in trying to dig in a little bit to that, there hasn't been anything that has resonated as to why there would be a decline there, but there was a slight decline for our multiracial students. And also of interest, an increase as well collectively for our special education population as well, specifically in Algebra 1. So this is an area that we do believe that we are on track for. Across the board. Our Algebra 1 proficiency, again, overall increased by the 3 percentage points, and we did identify that on the previous slide. So let's go back, please.
We have one question.
Okay, I'll go back.
Great.
Ms. Bolden?
Yeah, on the increases there.
One more slide, thank you.
There we go. Yeah, what's the comparative of the pool? Do we have more or less students? Is it, do we have more test takers, less test takers? Do we know about the volume of the pool itself?
Yes, so I can actually pull that number specifically. We've looked at it all day today.
That'd be great.
So in terms of, just give me 1 second, let me actually pull that up. It's relatively close, so there's not a huge variation, but I can give the specific number. Give me 1 second. And this information is coming directly from our secure data warehouse that is housed at the state level. So I just have to log into their site to pull it. Okay, so when we think about Algebra 1 specifically, and this is just looking at the overall district data, so I can't pull it by individual school, but district data, I think will give us more of the information that we're looking for. Sure. So if we look at Algebra 1 for the 18-19 year, which is when we started here pulling the data, there were 1,084 students that were tested that year. In the 2021 school year, there were 2,267 students that were tested. And then in the 21-22 school year, there were 2,888 students that were tested. And then last year there were 2,758 students that were tested. So a difference of about 120 students. So in terms of numerator versus denominator, still relatively close.
Yeah, and I think that's crucial on the 18-19 to be looking at that number because it wasn't everyone in the world. But that's why this begins to be more important.
Right. So in the 18-19 data, as you already know, there was a difference in the way that the district offered Algebra 1. And so not as many students were involved in Algebra 1. Then the push went to all students, well, in most schools. In Walnut, for example, the entry-level course for 9th grade is geometry, but at most of our other high schools, our Algebra 1 is taken in the 9th grade. So across the board, our 9th grade students are taking Algebra 1, and then at Walnut, they could have 7th or 8th grade students, but primarily 8th grade students are taking Algebra 1.
That smaller pool in 18-19 helps explain how radically different we're talking.
In terms of the numbers, absolutely. The thing that I also think is really important about it as well, and the question around the pool is, I also think that it's an opportunity for us to be more comprehensive and more inclusive, because what happens is if we don't offer the course to students, say in the 9th grade, we're just kicking the can down the field, so to speak. So because it is a graduation required course, the kids have to pass it at some point in high school. And so I know there was some conversation previously around Algebra 1A and Algebra 1B, so doing it over a 2-year period. I don't know collectively that the data across the country has shown that works to be more beneficial for students. My personal experience is that it has not been more beneficial for students, but the entry work leading up to what's happening in Algebra 1 definitely has been.
Thank you, Ms. Bolton. Ms. Jones.
Yes, I think you've answered my 2 questions. One is it required? So it is required generally when kids go into the 9th grade. They're expected to take the Algebra 1 course.
That is the way that it's set up right now in terms of progression for our district, except students that may be on an accelerated path. So if students are on an accelerated path, they may take Algebra 1 in 8th grade versus taking it in 9th grade. And the thing that I've always found unique about Algebra 1, honestly, as a math teacher and someone that has worked through changing the trajectory of where you go with Algebra 1, I think it's unique for us to think about. In 8th grade, Algebra 1 is considered advanced. In 9th grade, Algebra 1 is considered remedial. So as we think about that, what kind of preparatory work are we doing for students throughout our curriculum that takes us K through 7th grade to get more students eligible for Algebra 1 by the time they're in 8th grade? There is a lot of research that supports the more students excel at Algebra 1 at 8th grade, the more likely they are to be on a college-bound trajectory.
Are there students who, even though it's required, they may not take it in the 9th grade and maybe take it in the 10th or maybe even the 11th? I don't know.
I don't have examples of that now because in our district it is considered a 9th grade course, with the exception of Walnut. And just spending the time today with our high school principals, it's not been identified as students taking it in a different space. Where we could see those kinds of things would be, and this did come up as an opposite example. So we have some students that come to us from out of state or out of district, and they may take Algebra 1, but they've not passed the course. They took it before they entered the 9th grade. So because they did, they may not have had to take an end of course exam to go along with that, so they don't get the credit. Or they're coming into us as a 10th grade student, for example, and they've never taken Algebra 1, and they have to take it in order for them to graduate. So they may be entered into it at the 10th grade, but the norm for our district is 9th grade.
And then my final comment, I do find these numbers, the disparity, extremely significant. And so, yeah, I don't know what the message is around that, but we know we have work to do with that. We need middle school.
Get your answer, Ms. Jones?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that other board members on this one? I'm not sure I was a middle school teacher. I'm not sure the middle school is always the answer. It might be, it might not be. I'm open to a conversation about it. But I think one thing I'm grateful for, to your point, Ms. Jones, is that we are looking in a clear-eyed way about where we have the most work to do for children. And I think what's more important to me than whether it's one strategy or another strategy is whether it's actually working and whether it's actually making a difference. And I'm just really grateful that we have time for that in our meetings. And I want to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I lied. Vice President Craig.
I just wanted to add one thought, and again, it triggers something Board Member Jones said, triggered something in my head about this. I think the disparities within our math also is something societal that we have to be willing to acknowledge, which is that for a lot of ways, and I think you were just saying it, I think the next few slides actually will go into this, but it doesn't start at the Algebra 1.
That's right.
Right.
And it starts so far before then. And in a lot of ways, while reading is such a fundamental thing and we as a society understand it and respect it and appreciate it, there's almost this, the dedication that we have to reading is not necessarily the same dedication that we have to math at those early grades. And so that's one of the things I do worry a little bit about, is that we are having more students take it, which is an important part to it, but were those students, or where are our students now coming into those grades ready to take algebra at all? And I think that's some of the concerns that I've heard from some folks, and especially some of the anecdotal concerns, is that you get to this point where you have not taken those subjects, you have not covered the material, and then you're asked to kind of skip ahead to be in an algebra course. And that's a little bit worrisome, I think, in some ways, for preparing them to take the test.
Thank you, Vice President Craig. Ms. Bolton, and then Superintendent.
I appreciate what the Vice President said. I think that's very, very true. It's not just cultural or whatever. It's also a gender issue as well regarding math to a certain extent. But, very frankly, in high achieving districts, generally speaking, they know how big their calculus class is going to be by third grade. They know who's in third grade math, and they know if there's going to be a high school calculus teacher or pre-cal teacher needed in 10, 11, and 12. I mean, and they staff based upon that. It's fascinating.
Superintendent.
So a few different, I think just a little bit of feedback. So one, I agree and I concur that there's a lot of work to be done around where we are in terms of performance. I think one of the things that I recognize here that's been unlike the other two large urban school districts that I've been in, one with 117,000 students and 165 schools, and the other with 106 schools and 53,000 students, is in those other districts, the performance for math collectively for the urban students was higher than the performance for reading. And so when I think about that, I think in terms of thinking about the baseline and how we get there, it's really important, as I've had conversations with a few people that are sitting here now, or other board members or others in the community, one of the things that I hear often is math has always been a challenge for us. Math has always been a challenge. I hear that a lot. My child went to this particular school. They did well in reading and English, but math has always been a challenge. And so I think it's really important that as we begin to truly dig into that, we're thinking about where we sit in terms of coherence around math and our conversations around coherence. There is an actual chart that's called a coherence map that actually forms the basis of the curriculum that we're using for our math curriculum for our K through 6th grade students and for 7th grade through Algebra 1. And in the coherence map, it talks about the importance of the foundational skills for math, but also the spiraling curriculum. So when we go back to the importance of truly using the curriculum, one of the reasons that that's important is because the deep concept development actually brings algebraic concepts in much earlier than the time we brought them in when I was teaching the course 30 years ago. And it's just a different way of thinking about math, but it does require deep teacher content knowledge in order to be able to bridge those gaps for students and to help them think about how they're processing and doing concept development in a lot of different ways. Great conversation.
Any others? Okay, thank you, Superintendent.
Okay, next slide. And I think this is the one that Board Member Craig was referencing. So goal 3A here is to present the percent of our 6th grade students meeting the success criteria on math will increase from 31.8% in May to 40% in 2025. We did have most of our greatest increases this year were in the areas of math, and that's really exciting because of the lag that we see in reading and math. And so knowing that in many of the areas we had pretty significant improvement. Still not enough to get us where we're looking to go, but pretty significant. So we're at a closer space in terms of this particular sub-goal, or a goal 3A, because all of our students were at 31.8% for this year, which is a 4% increase over last year. When we look specifically at our individual populations of students, we see our Black students had an increase of about 2.4%. Our Hispanic students had the largest increase in terms of this area, and that increase was over 10%. And then our white students, 7%, our multiracial students, about 9%, and then a slight decline for our special education population, but an increase overall for our general ed population of 6% as well. So in this area, this is establishing the target because we were just getting started in this part of the conversation, but we did definitely want to call this out as a part of that goal 3A. Next slide. All right, now we look at the same thing for our 7th grade population. The first slide was 6th grade. Now we're at 7th grade. And the goal here is to increase for our 7th grade Black students meeting the criteria. It will increase from 12.2% in 2023 to 25% in 2025. And of course, for us to get there, it's going to take a real concerted process because the distance that we are away with our 7th grade students, we see the decline. We look pretty stable right around K through 6th grade. And then we see, we begin to see a decline in 7th grade, 8th grade, and then, into Algebra 1 and geometry. So just really identifying that and continuing to work through that process. For all of our students, we had an increase, all of our 7th grade students, we had an increase of about 4%. Our Hispanic students, a 10% increase. Our white students, a 7% increase. This is all 7th grade. Our multiracial students, about 12% increase, and then 6% overall for our general ed population. And that was for our 7th grade students. So it's going to take us more to get to that 25% for the 7th grade population, which is really one that's of concern when we think about where we go. Next slide. So let me go back to see if there are any additional questions around goals 3A, goals 3 or 3A.
And Superintendent, if I were to call these our interim goals,
They
am
are.
I using that term
That's
correctly?
correct. Mhm.
Any other questions or comments on 3A?
The real-
Ms. Bolton, I just want to see if anybody else wanted to go first. That's all right. Okay, Ms. Bolton.
Just the years, what are we calling the COVID years? 2021, 21, 22?
Right. So we call the COVID years actually, and it's not listed here, but 2021 would be the first COVID year.
Okay.
And then 21, 22 was the first year of getting back to quasi-normal, if you will. So the first full normal school year after COVID would be 22, 23. And we purposely didn't put in 19, 20 because there was no data that was taken from that year. So 18, 19 represents the last data set before the pandemic.
Thank you.
Any other, Ms. Jones, did you have a question?
No, I think, well, let me just make a comment. I think what I need to do is to go back and review the goals and guardrails and the interim goals, strategies. I don't know if this is a question or just a general statement. So you established this goal 3A to meet the benchmark for students to be will increase from 31.8 to 40%, 6th grade. Okay, and actually I think I'm referencing the one about closing the gap. So when you set these measures, are we looking at proportionately whether or not it's closing the gap between two populations, or are we just trying to improve the scores in one group of kids?
Great question. So if we go back to slide goal 2, so as we set the goal, because the closing the gap was the goal that was set as a part of the approved goals that the board actually selected. So in terms of doing that,
Yep.
in order for us to look at how we close that, the hope would be that we are growing our white population, but growing the population that has the largest gap faster than the white population is growing, because that is the only thing that shrinks the gap.
Yeah.
So when we talked about, so that was a goal that we selected as an area for us to
Okay.
focus on.
I got you.
Okay,
Okay,
so this one, this one is not an interim goal, but this one gives me a lot of concern because our goal is to make sure that, yes, we're doing the acceleration for the students that are not on track so that we get them to grade level proficiency as quickly as possible. But we also don't want to stop the learning for the students that are already continuing to progress. So I think this is one for us to really review, monitor, and watch very closely as we think about, closing those achievement gaps.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Thank you, Superintendent.
Okay, our next goal. And the next one is goal 5. I think this is our last one for today. The percentage of students who meet the requirements for graduation will increase from 85% to 97% by June of 2027. And looking at where we are right now, we believe that we're on target for this particular area. There was an increase from 21 to 22. The projected for 22 is 81.4, which gives us about a 1 percentage point increase. I do want to make sure that as we're looking at it and we're thinking about it, we also just continue to call back that on our actual report card, our data for graduation is always a year removed. So when we get next year's report card, it will actually be last year's graduation data that will be on the report card for us and on the report card for schools. So it will be 2 years before we see the actual data for that we're seeing as actual for right now. When we think about our graduation rate, we see that we have less of a gap across the board for our white and black students. Even though this one didn't talk as much about gaps, it is something for us to look at in terms of how we're graduating our students collectively. So less of a gap between our black students and our white students and our general ed students for that matter. So about 2% for our black to white students, and about 1% for our general ed students to our white students as well. In our special ed area, over the last few years, there has been an improvement, slight dip for this year of less than 0.2%. But where we do see challenge, and even though there was starting to be improvement, there's been some challenge over the last couple of years, the percentage of our Hispanic students that are actually graduating within the 4-year period. And so we see that there's a pretty huge, that's our largest gap in terms of disparity as we think about movement. And if we look back at where we were with the same area before COVID at all, we found that there was still a gap. While it wasn't as great as the gap now, we do know that the 1920 school year and the 2021 school year, there were provisions that were done at the state level, specifically in 1920, that allowed students to promote and to graduate without meeting the requirements for graduation because of the pandemic. So I think that that's something that we also want to think about and that we factor into these numbers as well. And again, in terms of thinking about acceleration and accelerating the goals, if we'll go back one more slide. Looking at where we are now, there's a lot to happen between now and 2027 to get us to 94%. We know for the large number of special needs students that we actually serve as well, there are some students that will finish school, but because of the way that graduation rate is calculated, they will not count as graduates. And so it's important that we connect with that also. The other piece that's important here is when we think about the report card portion for graduation rate, it is based on a 4-year graduation rate and a 5-year graduation rate. So for us here, we're looking at the 4-year graduation rate. The report card takes in both of those years. So the number of students that graduate when they should in the 4-year period and the percentage of students that need that 1 more year to graduate is averaged together. And that's how we actually get our graduation rate on the report card.
Thank you, Superintendent. Any questions on goal 5? Ms. Bolden?
Yes, is this based as the state does the measurement where it's the cohort that starts in ninth grade? And so you're really, that's what we're really talking about.
That's correct.
Thank you.
So the state uses the federal definition for four-year graduation, which is the year that you enter ninth grade. The one thing that I also think is important here that the more conversation that we've had with our school counselors and our principals, it doesn't matter when you enter ninth grade. So we have students that enter ninth grade throughout the year. The majority of them enter at the beginning of the year. But if you have a student that comes in February and they are a first-time ninth grader, that starts their cohort. So it's really not about where they were until that time, especially we have a lot of students that come from other countries that come in at different times as well. So I do want to make sure that as we're really, furthering developing and helping the community further understand what this area means, it's whenever a child enters the ninth grade. And the expectation is for them to be considered an on-time graduate. They graduate 4 years after that. And that includes the summer, but it's 4 years after that from that school year.
Thank you, Superintendent. Any questions, Ms. Bolden, with that answer, what you were asking? Other questions from board members? Okay. Is this our last slide?
We're going to keep moving to the next. So next steps is the last slide. In response to the data and current progress, I think that it's clear as we think about it and we looked at organizing our information in terms of improve, reconsider, and begin. And this may not be completely comprehensive, but these are the immediate things that we look to do in terms of next steps. So first of all, across the board, and I think I'm going to sound a little broken record-ish as I say this, but one of the first things that begins to show improvement for students is the level of instruction that's happening in Tier 1. And that's the kind of instruction that students are getting in class every day, all students. So what makes the instruction Tier 1 is that all students are receiving the instruction. So that's the first, making certain that we're doing quality implementation of our curriculum in the classrooms, including our reading curriculum across the board. Our district, even prior to the state making the decision that, or the governor making the decision that he made around the science of reading, our district was already committed to the science of reading. That is the way and the model in which we teach our children to read in our school district. And so making sure that we're continuing to do implementation with that, we're using our resources that have been provided by the district so that we're meeting the needs of the students. We found that there is a lot of benefit, and I think I shared this information earlier, and principals are also beginning to articulate the same as our teachers, that the supportive work that needs to happen for students, especially in that K through 8 space around reading, continuing to utilize iReady, the curriculum and the supports that go along with that as an additional resource. And I won't beat this, I just will say again, the reason for that is because it is both diagnostic and prescriptive. So not only does it identify where the deficits are, it gives a plan for students to work individually and additional supportive resources for teachers in terms of grouping, what to teach the students that are having deficits in those areas. So it helps to augment their instruction. And the last but not least in terms of improve is the implementation of our Algebra 1 curriculum. One of the things that we did last year as a part of the overall focus and evaluation was visiting all of our schools that were less than 3-star in the area of achievement. And a part of that was also looking at the implementation of the curriculum. And what we found is at our high schools, at our elementary schools, we got to the point at the end of the year where several of the schools were at 100% in terms of usage of our curriculum, and the average across schools was about 85%. For our high schools, that was about 54%. And so one of the first areas for us to begin to focus, and we've started this conversation with our school leadership, we're beginning to plan for additional professional development with our staff, but one is to start using the curriculum that the district has adopted that is aligned with standards and expectations. that's the place to start. There is not just one factor that goes into whether or not students are getting to proficiency, but at a foundational level, let's start with the same resource so that across schools, students are getting equity in the exposure that they're getting to content. And then from there, we begin to look at all of those outlying factors. I think we also want to reconsider the assignment and support process for credit recovery. There was a lot of conversation around Edgenuity and what recovery looks like, and thinking through that process as we think along the lines of trying to get students to improvement and to proficiency. So really doing some work groups and work teams around that, making sure that there is alignment there. But the other thing that's also important is making sure that there is an opportunity for students to do some kind of recovery before, and I'm talking for credit recovery for students that need to make up courses that they've not been successful in, especially at the high school level, before they get to their senior year. So that as they're moving along, we recognize why it's very difficult, and it's not a best practice to put them back in a class that they have already set through. That is not a best practice, nor is it financially prudent to do so, but offering them opportunities to take that coursework while also, and continuing to audit that coursework while also taking the coursework that keeps them on track. So continuing to look at that process and work with schools around that. And in terms of beginning to use the support for graduation cohorts through our graduation counselors, starting that process much earlier than previously, in the conversation even with principals today. And I think Board Member Jones actually brought it up before in a comment about Aiken, because the principal made the same comment today. For the students that are in their building, they graduate 100% of them that come to school. The challenge becomes students that enroll in 9th grade and they never end up anywhere else, and they still go against that school because they're on the denominator for the last school where they were. And so we really have to start that cleanup work for the process prior to 12th grade in order to allow schools to go into each year with as clean of a slate as possible for the students that are in their graduation cohort. And continuing to work on training on quality improvement with our reading and math specialists. We've started that work already. It's been very successful, but continuing to do that. And that's it that I have right now for next steps.
Thank you, Superintendent. Questions from board members before we break for the evening? We're out of here right on time. Ms. Bolton.
Yes, I remember several years ago, maybe it's more than several years ago, they talking about or reading often about what was called overage students.
Yes.
And that is so difficult for the teacher and for the student, and then the other students that aren't overage, to send a kid that had trouble passing back to that class often is disruptive to the kid, the class, and the teacher. And I know that we talked about this as a board, and our administration talked about it, and frankly, people were concerned about the visual image of creating classes of overage students as to what, they would learn about our district. If that visual image was there. So I'm really pleased that perhaps you're going to look at that and figure out what to do about those kids so that they actually have a good experience, even after they've had a failing experience, that somehow we can make it into a positive one and also not a disruptive one. Thanks.
Thanks, Ms. Bolton. Any other comments or questions? I have just a very quick one. Anybody else though before I go? Dr. Moffitt?
I think this data is really good. I would be very interested to see how we compare with the state. So if we could get an update on that, that'd be great. And also, I am just going to say, off of the topic of goals and guardrails, I'm still very interested in the student discipline data. I've sent that email, but I want us to kind of talk about that in student achievement as well. I think we can spend some time on this, but we've got, there are other things that impact these as well, and I'd love to have some reporting on that too. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dr. Moffitt. For one quick comment, can you go back one slide? Promise we'll still get out of here on time. You just said something to me that was fascinating, I think, Superintendent, that in the elementary schools at the end of last year, 85% of classrooms were using the board-adopted curriculum.
Yes.
And in high schools today, 54% are using the board-adopted curriculum.
Last year.
last year.
Mhm.
Any ballpark ideas? That's pretty similar to what it's like today. Has it gotten worse?
I think that for our elementary schools, we're still seeing the same in terms of movement. I think for our high schools, there's a lot more work to do. If based on just the observations up through now, probably about 50%, and in some instances less in some of the other grade levels. So for example, just to give some more color to that, last year we started with the biology curriculum. It's an excellent curriculum, but last year was the first year. And so making sure that teachers are comfortable utilizing that curriculum in the classroom with their students is something that's really important. So the other one that we are, and the principals have heard me talk about this all day today, the other one where there's a lot of challenge in terms of seeing the usage is the Algebra 1 curriculum. So we're really doing a reset around Algebra 1 to go back to, I don't believe, and I shared this with our union team today, I just don't believe that that many teachers are choosing not to use the curriculum. I believe that there's something else that we need to do to make sure that teachers understand how to use the curriculum, understand the implementation. And so that's where we'll start first, and then we'll reassess.
It could be. I appreciate you sharing that. The numbers are so striking. I mean, it's not just that we've spent however many millions of dollars on these curricula, which is certainly true, but they were vetted and selected by an incredibly representative group of people from across the district through, I think, a very strong process. And this is about the quality and the rigor of the work that are put in front of students. And there's enormous research behind the idea that, kids will rise to the expectations that we have for them, and this just feels like such an important step. And to know that only half of the classrooms are using it, this is, I think, gratitude for the administration being focused where you're focused. Because I think getting people to use with kids the curriculum that we've already adopted and paid for that will make a difference feels like a great investment of time and energies, and I want to say thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Ms. Bolton.
This precedes me even on the board, so it goes back almost 20 years. But we want to be very careful in this district ever to say anything that even remotely looks like, at least for our high schools. And I think that helps explain this difference between the elementaries. We want to be very careful about anything that says unified curriculum, because the first group of people that will be here will be the Walnut Hills teachers and administrators. The second group of people will be the Montessori high schools. Third group will be whatever. So it's very, very, it's a delicate thing. But I understand, I can understand why there's a difference between the elementary, and I'm very much that everybody has to at least do the standards. We're required by law to do that. But I've seen people get very perturbed about unified curriculum. So standards, yes, thank you.
I didn't mean to interrupt you, Ms. Bolton, I apologize. Mike, please.
I had somebody talk to me about what the big controversy was about unified curriculum.
I don't know, like if there are strong student outcomes in a building, why mess with what's working well? I think if there's a situation where there are not strong outcomes for kids, and we just spent the last hour looking at lots of examples of areas where they're not strong outcomes for kids, we got to do something different. Yeah.
And I think if I could reiterate, that's our messaging as well, and I think everybody knows there were some challenges prior to, my transition in May around curriculum and, people going into school buildings and removing curriculum from schools and all of those kinds of things. That's not the message. The message is so we started as a part of the conversation, one of the initial conversations that we had with the board, and I actually think, Board Member Bolton, it was you that made the comment in the conversation that we were having. If I go back to the recording in my head, it was, we spend a lot of money for curriculum, but our teachers are not using the curriculum, or do we even know if the teachers were using the curriculum? And so as a part of our focus, in terms of looking at that, we started that work very quickly, and we were able to quantify that number. I think this is the difference. We often talk about standards, we talk about autonomy, and all those things are great. Autonomy becomes earned when it comes to student outcomes and performance. So if you have individuals that are using things, or they're doing things with students and they are having success, they have, more than 80–90% of their students that are being successful. There are a lot of other things that we could say play into that, but at the end of the day, they're getting results for the students. That's not where our time has to be spent. Our time has to be spent in the spaces where we're not getting those kind of results for students, and starting with some kind of baseline in terms of that, and using those other individuals outside of the students that they're serving to talk about what's going well and what's not going well in terms of curriculum. So really the curriculum is the foundation. I don't think it's ever the end all be all in terms of thinking about teachers that really know their students and what their students need with them. And I would never ever support the process of going into a classroom and doing some kind of check off or checklist to say you're doing this and you're not. It is important what's happening in the classroom instructionally. But if the curriculum is not being used and the instruction is not high quality instruction that is aligned to standards, someone has to say something, because if not, the students are not going to be successful.
So I apologize, everybody, for it's my fault we stayed a little bit longer, but thank you, everyone. Most things are my fault. Having no other business before